Welcome to Frankly Speaking with Dr. Wade. This show was created for and inspired by the thousands of patients I've served, so it's time for me to speak up and speak out on their behalf. With a wide range of experts, we bring you weekly insights, diving deep into topics of controversy to bust through the sugar coating that keeps you and your family stuck in the mainstream. Hey everybody, welcome. Today I have my esteemed guest, Morley Robbins. I have been pumped ever since Morley and I got a chance to meet through another buddy, and we had a great discussion, and he inspired a ton of questions in me. And so I am super excited to bring him to you today. And this is one of 4 parts he's agreed to, which is crazy that he would do that prematurely till, we get into this, but now he's hooked. So anyway,
that's right. Yeah.
Thank you, Morley, for being with us today.
Yeah, I went from being the egg to being the bacon in this conversation, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Really looking forward to it. I think what's unfortunate, people don't know about the over hour-long, I think it was like 75-minute conversation that we had last week or week before, whatever it was. That should have been recorded. People would have gone nuts for that conversation. We really had a very productive tit for tat. It was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed that.
Well, I certainly did. I know it stimulated a bunch of unanswered questions for me, and it gave me some incredible insight to what I'm going through and what my patients go through every day, and looking at really being solution oriented. And that's what this is about. So today I bring you my kid-friendly headphones because I cannot find my earbuds, and
that's
okay.
What
happens is my nephews came in my office. So here we are.
That's great.
Morley, tell us about your history, specifically like what you did prior, and I think when you met your wife, and how that transpired into where you are today.
Absolutely. So as I tell people, I was raised in a very stressful environment. Most of us were. The way I characterize it is that 99% of us were raised in very chaotic home environments. The other 1% are lying about it. But born of a lot of, I was constantly going to the hospital to see relatives, see my parents or whoever it happened to be. Thought I wanted to be a doctor. Went to college as a pre-med, and as I now call myself, I'm a pre-med retread. Only 18 medical schools made sure I was never going to go to medical school. So I got 12 rejections in one day. That was a staggering moment, as I recall that. But yeah, it's just whatever. But if you can't be a doctor, then you go into business to be a hospital executive and boss them around. That's exactly what I did. That really wasn't my objective. I just thought it would make sense to go into hospital management. Did that for about 12 years, then was a hospital consultant for 20 years. And I know what stress is all about. I've lived the life, lived in metal tubes, going from one end of the country to the other and trying to solve problems all over the planet, if you will. But in a moment of crisis, I developed what's called a frozen shoulder. You certainly know what that's all about as a chiropractor, and went to a health food store that I had frequented for many years and asked them what they had for a frozen shoulder because I wasn't sleeping and it was really painful. And they said, well, you need to go see Dr. Liz. And I went, no, I don't do witchcraft, because I knew that was code for a chiropractor. So they sold me some supplements, and I tried that for a couple months, and it was no better after 2 months. I went back to the health food store and said, you must have something stronger. And the owner looked me in the eye and she said, Morley, we love you. Go see Dr. Liz. So with my tail between my legs, I went to see Dr. Liz, who is now my wife, I should add. This was 10 years ago. And she did what's called network chiropractic. You may be familiar with that approach. And so in her treatment room in north of Chicago in Evanston, she had 9 tables. And so she had a network of clients who were being given this light touch therapy. And her clients were healing each other. It was an amazing process. So I walked into this room with a bit of fear and trepidation. And prior to that, I couldn't hold my hand up above my waist. And within 2 weeks of this, I don't know what she did. I could raise my hand. I could, I had complete mobility. And it was blew my mind. I went, oh my God. I realized that I had to change my focus. I realized that allopathic medicine wasn't the answer. And it started this decade-long process of discovery of, really, I was answering, now looking back, I was answering two questions. Why is everybody so sick? And how can the most evolved species on the planet be anemic and have trouble processing the most prevalent metal on the planet, which is called iron? That didn't make sense to me at all. How could humans have anemia when we're supposed to be the most evolved species on the planet? That made no sense to me at the time. And so I've been reading daily for the last decade, 7 days a week. I spend about 3 hours each morning reading, and I've read thousands and thousands of articles. And anyone who's followed me knows that I cut my teeth on magnesium, and after a few years realized that wasn't the sole answer, and then discovered copper, was fascinated by copper, still am actually, but then discovered that it has a protein that makes it usable in the body called ceruloplasmin. We'll talk about that. And when ceruloplasmin is working right, you can metabolize iron. And when it's not working right, you can't metabolize iron. And when you get any form of inflammation, or as my clients down here in Louisiana call it, inflammation. Hey, doc, I got some of that inflammation. But any form of inflammation causes the recycling macrophages, those are the Pac-Men inside our body that are gobbling up red blood cells. It causes them to recruit the iron out of the blood because they know that good bacteria are in the gut, but the bad bacteria are in the blood. And so they got to pull that iron out of the blood, get it away from the pathogens so that the body can deal with whatever is causing that infection or inflammation. It's a fascinating process that's completely ignored by all manner of practitioners because they think that low iron in the blood means anemia, and it doesn't. It's fascinating. What it really means is iron is high in the tissue. But because we're using a blood test, we don't know what's going on inside the tissue because the blood doesn't reflect the tissue. We think it does, but it doesn't. So this has been a fascinating journey that started about a decade ago. And I focused on minerals. And now about, I guess 2.5, 3 years ago, developed what's called the root cause protocol. That's basically designed to increase the body's production of ceruloplasmin. And essentially the protocol is making sure we have more minerals, especially magnesium, and bioavailable copper, and that we have less iron. And when you do that and combine it with vitamin A, which is the real form of vitamin A, retinol. The most amazing thing happens in the body. It brings itself back into balance. And suddenly all manner of symptoms that people have begin to melt away. I was just talking to a mom whose 17-year-old son who was struggled with his health for most of those 17 years, the most immune challenged kid on the block. She says, he's got a great immune system now because of your protocol. So it's just, and again, I can't take credit for it. It's Mother Nature at her finest. And so this is restoring nutrients that were in the food system for millennia that got taken out of the food system about a century ago. And it's only gotten worse in the last probably 20 or 30 years, which we'll talk about, I'm sure. Mm. So that's my journey. I'm a biology undergrad. I've got a business degree. I've taken 4 different health certification programs. The only one that I really acknowledge is the one from the Institute of Integrative Nutrition up in New York City. And but I've gone through well coaches. I've gone through Jerry Tennant's program. I've gone through functional diagnostic nutrition with Reed Davis. I've gone through the nutrition response testing, ULON nutritional response testing, which you probably have heard of.
Mm-hmm.
So I've done a lot of different approaches, and basically decided to make up my own because none of that other stuff made sense to me. What I was trying to do was simplify it. And that was something that Dr. Liz and I were really focused on, was how can we simplify this process of helping people get well? And I think that's really what the root cause protocol does. It really helps a lot of people get down to the real nubbins of what the problem is.
There's a lot of places we could go from this point. So I'm going to just slide over to when you speak in such a way, and you saw me writing a couple things down there,
right.
because I can't help it. I have to just like make some sense of some of this. So ceruloplasmin is something you and I discussed, that it was, well, scientifically it was, well, this is what it does and it's no big deal. And you've since discovered through your research that there's 25 different antioxidant functions that you're on. Doesn't mean you're even maxed out yet, but that's what you've discovered, roughly 25 antioxidant functions of ceruloplasmin. Can we look at, so first of all, it's a protein and an enzyme, is that correct?
Well, yeah. So let's put it into context for the listeners, because we start using these terms, proteins and enzymes, they're like, what the heck are you talking about? So think of a protein, think of it as like a car. But most cars have an engine, right? Right? And when you put the key in the ignition, you can turn on the engine. So when the car starts to move, it's operating as an enzyme. It's making something happen. It's causing something to change. So that's really the difference between a protein. Think of it as a protein is inactive, an enzyme is active. And further context would be, everybody knows what insulin is. It's really important for digesting sugars. Most people don't know what it really does, but that's not important. But it's a hormone that has 25 amino acids. It's pretty powerful, but it only has 25 amino acids. Ceruloplasmin, which was first identified by Carl Holmberg in Sweden in 1941, the same year they started adding iron filings to the food system. I think that was an accident. But when he discovered it, it had 1,066 amino acids. This thing's 40 times bigger than insulin. Right. This is like the spaceship Enterprise compared to a biplane. And it has, well, when it was first discovered, it had 8 coppers inside it, 8 copper atoms. And it had 8 coppers for 30 years. And then in the 70s, it went down to 7. And then it was 7 for 30 years. And then it's down to 6 now. God knows where these coppers are going. I think that might have to do with the vaccine program that our buddy is battling, but we won't go there right now. But the point is, the conformational structure of this protein and the coppers inside it have changed in the last 70 years. That's a fact. Or almost 80 years now. But the important thing is, there are the overriding premise of big pharma is one gene, one protein, one function. It's 1-1-1. You've got to believe that. Wade, if you don't believe that, then we've got a problem. We're going to have to spend a lot of time retooling your brain, because it's one gene, one protein, one function. Well, that's not how the body works. I mean, there's only 25,000 genes, and there's like over 100,000 different proteins that get produced, which is amazing. And my best calculations, there are about 9,000 enzymes that really matter in the body. And they all work just like the car you drive. So when was the last time you drove a car without a key. Unless you're Fred Flintstone, that's pretty hard to do.
Right.
And so people don't realize that these minerals that are supposed to be in our food are in fact the catalytic agents that turn proteins into enzymes that enable the metabolism to work. And when we're under stress, when we're under acute stress, like we're in a car accident, there's a massive loss of magnesium and B vitamins to respond to that crisis. It's just the way we're wired. But if the stress continues, if we suddenly take a job with a really lousy boss, or we have a real change in our relationship, or suddenly we start eating a very toxic diet and that stress becomes chronic, well, what happens is the liver basically locks down the copper. It says, you apparently don't know how to survive this life, and I'm not going to make it any easier for you. And so then you've got both magnesium and copper being locked down and lost. Well, then you can't make energy. And then you've got a crisis on your hands. Because what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to metabolize stress by making energy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very fundamental premise. But most people don't realize that. And so when they're under chronic stress, they start to get fatigued. And so they start to flog their adrenals or they flog their thyroid, not realizing that that's not where the problem is. It's the stress of their life that's losing minerals. That's where the real crisis is.
So you said a mouthful there, all the way back to the number of genes we have and then number of enzymes roughly that are meaningful, about 9,000. And the stress cascade that one of my mentors helped me understand, that I'm still just really unfolding the magnitude of the stress cascade and how the thyroid gets hit twice in the stress cascade. And you and I discussed the adrenal glands and, the fact that the thyroid may manifest some of the stress or be the typical scapegoat that we have to look back and say, what are the adrenals doing along the line? So I'm sharing that because this conversation becomes about stress, and people want to dilute. The word is like wellness. It's very generically broad-based now, to the point where it's so diluted that we kind of miss that meaning. So if we're going to talk stress and what our body does, since magnesium is kind of where your foundation started, you have a great way of explaining that if our body's like enzymatically in crisis, the daily homeostatic mechanism is to have enough energy to what? Meet the demands of life, whatever they are, and they're always changing.
Right.
And our perception of that is changing. So I have a challenge over time. People get, I'm stressed, but when they think they're not stressed anymore because they're so numb to the chronic nature of it,
exactly,
that they don't realize that depletion. Can you go into like magnesium deficiency, why, how it happens, what chronic stress does, where does it start?
Yeah, no, it's a very critical aspect of this whole discussion. So the best definition of stress I've ever come across, excuse me, by Mark Hyman. And I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with Mark Hyman. He heads up the integrative medicine at Cleveland Clinic. Stress is the body's inability to make energy for the mind to respond to its environment. It's really, really very succinct, very powerful. And I think it really captures the essence of it, is that, and again, it goes back to what you alluded to in just a minute ago. It isn't just the stress, it's our perception of the stress. And that then we begin to draw on the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which is really the master regulator of stress in the body. And it's very well researched in the literature that if someone has low magnesium, well, the HPA axis goes crazy. The thing that surprised me in the last probably 2 years was to discover that it isn't just magnesium that's important for the HPA axis. It's retinol.
Hmm.
Retinol is incredibly important to calm down the stress response. Because that's really what we want to do is not perceive everything as a threat. And when you have lower levels of magnesium, and the statistics are, I think the most accepted statistic is that about 80% of people are magnesium deficient. Well, if we take that at the clinical precise aspect that it's meant to be, what magnesium deficiency means is that the magnesium level is so low, it will show up on a serum blood test. And that's an oh my God moment. That's
Now,
when it's that low, you got a serious problem.
so that's the 80% that qualify for low magnesium, which says that's ultra conservative.
That would be the most
Okay,
conservative interpretation of it.
that's what we want
And what I do is I usually say that almost everyone is magnesium deficient. Why? Because we live in North America. We have a corrupt food system, and we have a lot of stress in this country. All you got to do is spend 5 minutes listening to the news, and you're like, oh my God, why do I live here? That's stressful.
Oh boy, yeah.
It's insane. So, I mean, they couldn't prove that there was collusion. There's no such thing as collusion. It's not even a legal term. It's like, oh my God, we just went through 2 years of insanity. But the point is that it isn't just the stress, it's our perception. Well, who's the great perceiver? It's the hypothalamus.
Mm-hmm.
So you and I are engaged in what's called a conscious conversation, where we're exchanging information at about 2,000 bits per second, which is pretty fast. But the hypothalamus is the size of an almond. If you were to drill a hole here and here, you'd get to the hypothalamus, right? And the size of an almond, has 64 chambers, and that's where electrical energy becomes chemical energy. That's where all the master regulatory hormones are made, and all the key neurotransmitters are made. Well, the hypothalamus thinks 1,000,000 times faster than you and I can talk. And what happens, one of the greatest stresses we put on our body is taking our high IQ minds, going to the internet, looking up our symptoms, and then doing a manual override to the hypothalamus that knows exactly what to do if it's fed the nutrients that run it. What are those nutrients? Turns out minerals are really important, like magnesium and copper. And retinol, that's real important. If you have retinol deficiency in the hypothalamus, you're screwed. And so then there's a cascade of dysfunction that follows. Well, magnesium and cortisol are on a seesaw. So if magnesium's up, what would you guess cortisol's doing? It's down, yeah. And if magnesium's down, guess who's up? Cortisol, right. And so when cortisol is up, again, all the confusion in conventional thinking is this idea that hormones run the body. They don't, because every hormone is made from an enzyme that's got to be activated by a mineral. And cortisol is just like all the others. And so these hormones have a job. What's cortisol's job? Protect potassium in the body. That's its job. It's trying to protect potassium status. And so most of the clients in your practice have been abused with a form of stress that they wouldn't think of. It's called vitamin D supplements. And it's very important for people to know that Dr. John Ferris, who was a noted professor of medicine at a little school up in Connecticut called Yale Medical School, in 1962 wrote an article about vitamin D supplements cause renal potassium wasting. That would be another form of stress. When the kidneys are forced to excrete potassium, you got a crisis on your hands. And so people don't realize that there's a metabolic price tag to some of the supplements that they're taking, or some of the foods that they're eating, or whatever lifestyle they're engaged in. And that's where it's so important to have this grounding about stress and that there are many different forms of stress. And it isn't just emotional stress. Or, I don't have any stress in my life. It's like your food is stress. Your lifestyle is stress. The type of work you do is stress. Having to drive an hour to work and back is stress. Anytime the body is put under a challenge, there's going to be stress. And people, they tend to discount all of that, not realizing that they're under constant stress, especially in this particular locale that we find ourselves in. And so it's understanding that stress dynamic is what really helped me get a real understanding that when I read an article about iron by a noted Italian iron researcher, and he said one of the greatest stressors to the human body is iron stress. And I went, what? And so that happened about 7 years ago. I read that article. I was like, oh my God, what does that mean? And what he was referring to is oxidative stress. And so we all have bodies that have red blood cells. You and I have about 25 trillion red blood cells in our body. And that's a lot of red blood cells.
Yep.
About 25% of our cells, not accounting for the 10 times that of bacteria that are helping to run our body. But we won't go there right now.
Of our own cells.
Of our own cells.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we've got this 25 trillion red blood cells. Well, that's where 80% of the iron in the human body is tied up in red blood cells. It's called the erythron. That's the whole totality of everything that deals with birthing, making, recycling red blood cells. It's called the erythron. Well, that's where 80% of the iron is. So let's take the surface area of those 25 trillion red blood cells. And believe it or not, someone had already done this, thank God. And it turns out it's just under an acre of surface area.
Wow.
So that's an acre of iron inside our body, Wade. Now, just to drive the point home for people. So people will struggle with, but what's an acre? It's a football field, essentially. So people can right away, they can say, oh, I know what a football field looks like. So take the football field in your mind, that's inside your body, this football field. Now take a penny and put it in the corner of that football field. Well, that penny it's supposed to be made of copper. We'll pretend that it's still made of copper, even though it's now made of zinc. But when it was made of copper, it was very special, and it was 90 milligrams of copper. And that's the amount of copper that's needed to regulate that near acre of iron. It's about 5,000 milligrams of iron. And so it's a 60 to 1 ratio of iron to copper, but it's that little penny of copper that regulates that football field of iron. It's called, in football, we call it the gridiron, right? Isn't that what it's called? Yep. The gridiron, right there. That's what it's all about. It's inside our body. And what's happened is that the food system and the farming system and the pharmaceutical system have unwittingly turned that penny of copper into a BB of copper. And that BB doesn't have 90 milligrams. And because that BB is not big enough, there's a lot of oxidative stress in our body that causes enzymes to get rusty, because that's what oxidative stress is. We all know what a rusty nail looks like, or a rusty pipe. That's called oxidative stress. Well, we call it rust. Well, that rusting process is taking place inside our bodies, and it affects those 9,000 enzymes. But we've never thought about it that way. And when you mix iron and oxygen, you get an explosion. It's called rust. The reason why we are able to live on this planet is that actually the very origin of the planet, there was no copper and there was no oxygen. It's fascinating. Everything, all the life forms lived on iron. And then about 2.5 billion years ago, and I don't know how they know this, but they profess to know this. And a great article about this is by Robert Crichton from 2001. It's an amazing article about old iron and young copper, and fascinating article about the origin of the planet, and that up until 2.5 billion years ago, no oxygen. Suddenly, photoplankton started producing oxygen. Again, they don't know why. And when that happened, when that oxygen started to build up, it wiped out 99.9% of life forms on this planet because oxygen and iron explode, and life could not exist on it.
So everything froze up, locked up.
Absolutely. And somehow, this is the most mysterious part of it. Where does iron come from? Mars. It's red. That's why it's red. Where does copper come from? Venus.
Wow.
Yeah, it's blue, right? And somehow, this is amazing. Somehow the planet recruited copper. I mean, they still don't know how it happened, but because copper started to appear, we were able to work with that oxygen. They're like, what are you talking about? Well, in our body, that hemoglobin, those billions and billions and billions and billions and trillions of hemoglobin, they're waiters carrying oxygen, right? But who's the chef activating that oxygen? It's copper. Copper is the only metal on this planet that can work with oxygen and turn it into water so that it can release ADP at complex 4 of the mitochondria, which then goes over to complex 5 to become what's called magnesium hyphen ATP. But no one has ever spelled it that way. But that's technically what it is. If the ATP, this is ATP, and this is ATP holding magnesium. Did the shape of the ATP change? It sure did. Now, technically, the magnesium is being held up here, but that you can't get your head around that. Right. But the point is, when that structure changes, then the body can recognize the ATP and it can metabolize the ATP. If it's not holding that magnesium, it's wearing an invisibility cloak and it can't see it. And what happens under stress? What's the first thing that happens under stress? When the pH of the tissue goes down to 6.2, the ATP pulls apart, the magnesium drops. And I don't know whether you've ever had the pleasure of being in an operating theater where they were doing heart surgery, bypass surgery. It's fascinating. I actually had a chance to tag along with Peter Perolero, who was at that time was the chief of surgery at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And it was like for like 10 hours, I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. But they were phobic about the pH of the heart. He kept asking, what's the pH? What's the pH? Because if it gets down to 6.2, all the ATP in the heart, and it makes a lot of ATP in the heart. It takes about 1 billion ATP for one heartbeat. Let your mind get around that. Talk about stress.
Oh my God.
So when you get down to 6.2 and all the ATP start opening up and releasing that magnesium, that's called a heart event. We call that a heart attack. It has nothing to do with a block. That's all conventional insanity. And again, this idea that, the plaque builds up and the blood can't get through, that's not what's happening. There's no energy to support the cardiomyocytes. And if they can't pulse and do their thing, then the heart, that section of the heart just dies from a lack of energy. So that's a very stressful event, as you can imagine.
That's awesome. That's awesome awareness. It's just putting all this together, making all kinds of great notes. Well, they're not so great. They're just documentation, but it's because you're going from one thing to the next. So you said something about the incorporation of copper. So here we are. People are like, well, I just know that oftentimes the ability for my my patients, my community, I should say, moreover,
Right.
is like we're so duped into this model allopathically that whatever they say, I mean, and that distrust is building, and it's of course, free thinkers are like questioning everything about it. But I would still say the mainstream theory is that, well, we just don't question certain things like fat is, saturated fat is bad for you. Well, it depends what generation you grew up in, right? Because we
That's
heard
right.
fat's bad. So, breaking that mold is a day-to-day challenge, and it's literally just based on how long that's been playing in their head, right? The tape, the loop. So when you say, well, iron has these levels, and that we're 5,000 milligrams of iron in the body tissues to about a normal healthy range is about only 90 milligrams can help regulate that copper or iron and keep it from being oxidatively stressful.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's down to a BB, which acts as to about what level is that? How many
It's probably
milligrams?
about maybe 50 or 60 milligrams. It's much
Okay.
it's much reduced. Again, think of it this way. What's a fever? A fever is a 4% differential in body temperature. So you go from
4%.
98.6 to 102. That's a 4% change in body temperature.
Yeah.
And you know how bad you feel when you have a fever, right? So imagine losing 40% of copper in your body.
Mm.
And there are studies, Wade, where they have administered antibiotics, amoxicillin, doxycycline, Z-Pak, Cipro. What would you guess is the loss of function in key copper enzymes in the liver? Just a wild guess.
Let's just say you mean from those, from
Mm-hmm.
adding those things?
Yeah.
It could be as small as 1% made a huge difference. It could be 20% by the load it puts on the liver. So
40% loss of
wow.
copper enzyme function. So basically what they've done is they've designed a whole class of medication, wink, wink, that's designed to chelate copper out of the liver, wink, wink, causing a devastation of the copper-dependent antioxidant enzymes that are designed to kill pathogens, wink, wink. You have no idea how devastating it is. You and your listeners don't have no idea what Cipro does to copper status in the body. It's a nightmare. And what is Mother Nature's antibiotic? It's called copper.
Hmm.
It's again, what do all pathogens live on? This is the only thing that Louis Pasteur forgot to tell us. What do all pathogens live on?
Iron.
Yeah, they live on iron. So what was Pasteur's job? His job was to move the cheese away from iron and get people obsessed with the pathogens. And he was very successful at that. Even though his arch rival, Antoine Béchamp, kept saying, no, it's the field. And allegedly, there's all sorts of dispute about this, but allegedly on his deathbed, Pasteur said that Béchamp was right. And who knows whether he actually said it. But the point of the matter is, 1850s is when insanity was officially inserted into our mind about how disease takes place. It was always about iron. And our ancient ancestors knew that. They knew about bloodletting thousands of years ago. And again, it's insane that we think that when the blood test shows I've got low iron in the blood, well, I've got to have more iron. It's like it's the worst possible thing you can do. Is that we were designed to have what's called nutritional immunity. And what that's code for, this is written up in a lot of the literature, nutritional immunity is knowing that you shouldn't ingest iron because it feeds pathogens. It's the most toxic element you can ingest. Now, what's fascinating is that there are 9 different forms of iron being added to the US food system. And what's important for people to understand is that in order to be considered a carcinogen, an element must either initiate cancer, promote cancer, or progress cancer. Got to do one of the three: initiate, promote, or progress cancer. And there's only one element on planet Earth that does all three. Can you guess what it might be?
Starts with an F, ends with an E.
Yeah. Iron. And so back to those 9 different forms of iron being added to the food system, how many of them have been classified carcinogens?
All
of them. Isn't that amazing? And so how stupid are we? And so the incidence of cancer used to be 1 in 200 at the turn of the century, and now it's 1 in 2. And I know that's a subject that's near and dear to your heart. I'm not trying to poke the eye in the bear, but the point is, we're being drowned with the very element that's causing all of our conditions, and people don't realize it. What's really important for people to really get centered around is, if people have not read the book 1984, or if they have not watched the movie The Matrix, they need to do both, because that's what we're living. We're living a very Byzantine world where black is white and white is black. And there really is this very toxic system that controls us, and we've got to get off the grid if we're to survive.
Okay, quick question.
Yeah.
Some listeners can completely resonate with that, and some are like, "Whoa, I can't handle the truth with this." You can't handle the truth. So we'll get into more of that, but here's some. We were very, very awesomely, frankly, spoke there about very simplistic 9 forms, all carcinogenic, all meet the criterion: initiate, promote, progress. Yet it's in our food systems. And here's what I find is a sticking point. It actually is not a sticking point. It's a sliding point, because it allows the listener, my patients, our community, everywhere in the United States, for people to just say, oh, that's not true, because they wouldn't allow it in our food in the first place. And this is back to, they have my best interests, or it wouldn't be out there. And what you're literally saying, not that I completely, well, let me rephrase that, because that started to come out wrong. Not that I disagree with any of it.
Right.
Is that they have to be their best patient. You have to be your patient's advocate.
Right.
Like,
right. Exactly.
You're risking saying this, number one. I'm risking saying this. And yet, what's the real risk? Our patients. So what are we trying to do? Trying to help them understand how every little thing they're doing day to day. How about like this? If you question this, look on any nutritional bar you have. Look on any boxed or packaged food you own in your house. Look at any drink or soft, or look at your nutrition, look at your supplements, and you will see something about iron, whether there's 0 or there's some micrograms or milligrams in it. And so when you look at where you're getting iron, you're getting it everywhere.
No, it's true. And see, wait, I didn't know any of this until a few years ago. I mean, I'm kind of a babe in the woods. I was like, wow, why is everyone so sick? And then I start to dig, and then you find out, well, wait a minute. They started adding iron filings, not organic iron, inorganic iron, iron filings to the wheat flour in 1941. The book that people really need to read, if they really want to get down, I think what you just said is very important. My whole mantra, and I think yours as well, and people that follow you, what they're seeking is empowerment. They want to know what they can do for themselves to take care of themselves. And I firmly believe that that's really what at the end of the day, we need to be able to take care of ourselves, because our body, when it's fed properly, actually has the innate intelligence. And you know what that term means from your chiropractic training. Unlike most other practitioners who don't have a philosophy, chiropractic does have a philosophy and honors the innate intelligence of the body. And there are some key nutrients that are needed to support that innate intelligence, not the least of which is bioavailable copper. And the book that people need to read to really understand how serious this situation is, it's a book by Dr. Jim Moon. He spells his first name differently. It's Jym. moon, just like the heavenly body. And it's called, the title is Iron, the Most Toxic Element. Dr. Moon was a metal toxicologist. He was a very gifted metal toxicologist. He just passed away about a little over a year ago. It's a tragic loss to the scientific community. But in any event, he was very focused on iron, wrote this wonderful book. I've read it 4 times now. I learn something new each time I read it. But that's where I learned all of these nuances about iron. And one of the others that's really important is iron is attracted to and stored by tissue that is damaged. That's a really important thing to understand. Attracted to and stored by tissue that is damaged. We'll come back to that in just a minute because I think it's an important point for your listeners. But the point that he makes in this book is to talk about the Delaney Amendment, because people are always like, well, how could they possibly put iron in if they know it's going to cause cancer? Well, Senator Delaney was from the great state of New York, and in the 1950s, he passed what's called the Delaney Amendment to the Food and Drug Administration, or the Food and Drug Administration Act, I guess. And the Delaney Amendment said that no known carcinogen, I think this was in 1956, no known carcinogen could be added to the U.S. food system with one exemption. Now, you're a smart guy. What was that exemption?
To iron.
It's iron. And that exemption existed for 75 years. Unbelievable. And so we live in a very twisted world. And it's very unsettling to think that it's really that black is white and white is black. And I didn't believe it at first. But the world makes a whole lot more sense when people come to accept that and adopt the philosophy of Alvin Toffler, who wrote the book Future Shock. And in that book, he makes 3 very clear statements. Learn, unlearn, relearn. And I think it's time for people to do is unlearn what they think they know about health and relearn it based on minerals. Because minerals and mineral metabolism is not taught in any practitioner training that I know of. And again, we're back to those 9,000 enzymes needing a key to turn on the engine. And 42% of those enzymes, 3,751 enzymes, require magnesium as a catalyst. That's only 42%. So it's like losing your arm and your leg if you're under stress.
It's only 42%.
Only 42%.
Just a flesh wound.
That's right. And that's the foundational awareness that people need to have in order to really appreciate, well, why am I always so tired? Because I can't make energy. Why can't I make energy? Because you're constantly under stress and you're losing magnesium and you're losing copper. And what I missed completely was that the railway, or the locomotive, I guess I should call it, the locomotive of allopathic medicine. This is very important. The locomotive of allopathic medicine runs on 2 rails: iron toxicity and magnesium deficiency. And just like any railroad you've ever seen, those rails never touch, but they're bolted together. Right? And so what is important is I only know of one author who had the courage to talk about the fact that excess iron causes magnesium loss. And his name is William Wiglicki. He's like 76, 77-year-old. He's a physician. He was a cardiologist at Harvard at one point. And he started focusing on magnesium deficiency as a cause of heart disease. And the elders at Harvard said, we don't need that kind of talk. And so he was summarily kicked out of Harvard. And he ended up at George Washington University and did amazing research, continues to do amazing research. He's always asking me if I've got some money for him to do more research. He's a very, very cool guy. But he's the guy that was able to link iron and magnesium loss. And what does iron do? It causes oxidative stress. And what does oxidative stress do? It burns up magnesium. And so I coined the phrase, the magnesium burn rate. When your stress is up, your magnesium burn rate is up. And when you've got too much iron in your body, you're burning through magnesium faster than you can imagine.
All right, how much do I say? Wow, interesting.
Does it make sense? That's the most important thing.
Oh my gosh, it makes total sense to me. So let's break it down for those who aren't like deep this high in nutritional knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to the person that's struggling right now? The patient says, I'm struggling with frozen shoulder like you did, or I have this nagging hip pain, and I get adjusted and it helps, but I can't seem to get over this hump where this nagging hip pain is there. So they look and they consult an appointment with their doctor because this crazy guy down in Louisiana says that it's possible there is, or their wacky chiropractor in Madison. So either way, says that there's probably some toxicity in iron, which we know creates inflammation. So let's say their job isn't stressful and they don't have kids anymore, and they pretty much live on easy street because they're just, that's most people these days. Not really, but anyway, let's just rule out some of the obvious things, or maybe some of the things that they're not fully grasping have that magnitude. Just the iron alone, stress to the body, is depleting the magnesium. And they're in a state. Now, this could be the next conversation because of time. We could continue here too. It's up to you. I think we were planning on going 75 minutes like we discussed.
That's so, yeah. I'll
just the
talk
iron,
your off, Wade.
the iron alone is enough to create the inflammation and oxidative
Absolutely.
stress.
Yeah.
Let alone the fact that they're not going to get support. So how do they actually? So they go to their medical doctor after hearing this and say, I want my blood tested for iron. What's the number one mistake that's made as a result of that question? Why they'll still not succeed at my doctor says I don't have high iron. Let's talk about that.
No, that's great approach. So from 1860 to 1972, clinicians and scientists knew that to measure iron status, you measured the amount of hemoglobin that was in the blood.
Okay.
Well established over 100-year time period, 150-year time period. In 1972, Jacobs et al. Published an article in the British Medical Journal about ferritin. And ferritin is a storage protein for iron, which you've heard of, and I'm sure many of your listeners have. But it's not essential for our metabolism. We've been trained like circus bears to believe that it's really important, when in fact it serves no metabolic function other than to store excess iron. When you have too much iron in your body, the body will make ferritin to wall it off. And so what the biggest mistake, which you were asking about, what's the biggest mistake, is that doctors will do what's called a ferritin-only blood test, and they'll make some declaration based on that one test. Here's what people don't know about that process, that ferritin is an intracellular protein, supposed to be inside the cell, but it's being measured in an extracellular medium called the blood. That's outside the cell. When you're baking cookies, do you care whether the room temperature is 72 degrees or the oven temperature is 350? Well, let's focus on the oven temperature. Right. And a ferritin blood test is room temperature. Doesn't tell us anything about what's going on inside the oven or the cell. So that's the first mistake. Second mistake is that ferritin comes in two flavors. heavy and light. Well, heavy has this, what's called ferrooxidase enzyme function, which is one of the principal enzyme functions of that protein ceruloplasmin. And it's very important because you cannot load iron into ferritin unless you have copper. Not a lot of people know that. So we have two flavors, heavy and light. The light just stores iron, but it's like, it makes no sense at all. And when you're getting a blood test, they don't distinguish between heavy and light. So we don't really know what we're getting. The third issue is to come to terms with the fact that when the body can't load iron into ferritin because it doesn't have the ferrooxidase function, that iron becomes loaded into what's called hemosiderin. So ferritin is like an ATM machine. Hemosiderin is like a bank vault that requires a manager with a key and a combination to open it up. It's very complicated. So hemosiderin is where iron goes to die in the body, but it's not measured in a blood test. No practitioner you've ever gone to or even know of has ever measured hemosiderin in a patient's body.
Because you can't technically measure it.
No, we're just supposed to ignore that problem. And then here's the coup d'etat. There's a very famous iron researcher in England. His name is Douglas Kell. He's at the University of Manchester. And he was recently acknowledged for his scientific work. He wrote an article called Iron Behaving Badly, and it was published in 2009. And when a scientist wants to make a statement with an article, they'll usually have about 150 citations, 150 footnotes. And in Dr. Kell's article, Iron Behaving Badly, there were over 2,400 footnotes. And what he was telling the clinical and scientific community is, you're not just wrong about ferritin, you're dead wrong. And what he was pointing out is that when ferritin shows up in the extracellular medium of the blood, it's already discharged its thousands of iron atoms. And it's what's being measured in the blood test is the empty protein, not the protein with iron in it.
Smoke and gun.
Smoke and gun, exactly. And so the iron has already caused the damage in the tissue. And why is the ferritin showing up? I asked Dr. Kell, this is a very important part of the conversation at the beginning of our exchange. He's about my age. He's got this big wall of books behind him. This guy's just uber. He's just really, really smart. Very affable, though. And I said, what's the ideal ferritin level for a human? And he said, 0. I went, what? And he said, Morley, he said, I want to make sure you understand this. He said, ferritin is not synthesized in the blood. It is secreted in the blood. And it is secreted by organ pathophysiology. Do you understand what I'm saying? I said,
I do.
Yes, sir, I do. And so all of this foment about ferritin needs to be at a certain level. Like, what I find very comical is people who take thyroid medications thinking that their ferritin needs to be between 70 and 100 to make it work right. I'm like, are you serious? Do you understand what that really means? And so the world has been twisted into thinking that the storage protein is doing us a favor. And in 2004, a very noted pathologist, his name was Jerry Sullivan, who developed what's called the iron heart hypothesis. And he was able to prove that all heart disease is caused by excess iron. It's a very controversial theory, as you can imagine, including the rise of cholesterol that's caused by excess iron. But in 2004, he wrote a very important article, and the title is Stored Iron Safe? And it's one of the most beautifully written articles I've ever read. And in it, he points out the very problem that I'm sure we'll talk about in subsequent conversations. He says that the innate immune system
excuse me,
and our internal antioxidant and anti-inflammatory system is designed to be run in a body that does not have excess iron. So when you have excess iron in your body, the frequency of the body changes. Yeah, that's it.
let's do this. If I can do this.
There you go. That's it.
So there's Sullivan. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, by the way. This is a great article.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Wonderful article. But in a body that has too much iron, the anti-inflammatory and antioxidant enzyme pathways don't work right. Well, those anti-inflammatory and antioxidant pathways are all based on bioavailable copper. So what was the purpose behind adding iron filings to the food system in the very year that Dr. Holmberg discovered ceruloplasmin? It was to neutralize the discovery of the protein that regulates iron in the body. Ceruloplasmin is the master regulator for iron. It's incredible.
Okay, just a sec. There's too much going on there. There's way too much going on there. So you said the antioxidants and what else are not designed to run?
Anti-inflammatory pathways.
Okay, so let's stop right there. Okay, because this is a huge thing. Many people know about what we do in our office, but many people don't. And so I will just quickly, how do we get to this point is my point, is that the demands in our office have changed the direction of our practice based on what my patients and what our community suffers from and experiences.
Right.
And I'm a problem solver more than anything. I mean, that's my goal. That's my role, I should say. My role awareness is to help solve a problem. And when I ask questions as a detective, I am literally, I'm looking for upstream. And this is exactly where this conversation goes with Morley, which is why I love what you're bringing to the table. And I love your experience along this line. And I hope everyone really starts to appreciate this as this unfolds. But anti-inflammatory and now methylation, because this is a whole, maybe this is part 3 down the road here, but antioxidants have a function in the body is what Morley's saying. And our anti-inflammatory response naturally occurring in the body has its own response. You on board have that, except when you don't, which is what happens when iron gets higher than normal and you're sitting there struggling for holding alignment, wondering why you eat organic food and you still don't feel great. And all these little things that you're putting your ducks in a row and you're not getting the results because our soil, the body versus the seed, the soil being the body is still infertile. In this case, it's too iron fertile, which means it's a very opportunistic growing field for pathogens. And it makes it really, really hard. It's like swimming upstream with no energy. You're gonna lose. It's just a matter of time.
So let's just sharpen the focus for people. The question that I teach my students that go through I call it's the Copernican training. Copernicus changed the world with his perspective. And that's what this whole focus about copper and iron does. Changes your whole understanding about what the origin of the problem is. But I ask 2 questions. I don't really care about people's symptoms. I want to know, when did the symptoms start? When? First question. Second question is, what was the stress in your world just before that happened? And what's important for people to realize is that when we are under stress, we do lose minerals, and that when we're in a state of chronic stress, we enter a state of fear. And what happens when a state of fear is our body contracts and our pH becomes acidic. Well, any farmer will tell you that acidic soil attracts iron. So we become magnets for iron when we're under stress. So when that person's worrying about holding their alignment, or they're not able to digest their food, what you've got to do is take them back, go upstream, just like you're suggesting. But we got to go to the metabolic origin of when the stress affected their physiology.
Hmm.
And I've talked to over 6,000 people, and I'm batting 1,000. Everyone can tell me exactly when their crisis started. Precisely. They know exactly what it is. And then when they start to realize that it was the stress that was causing the mineral loss, that the mineral loss then affected the enzymes, and that the enzymes that don't work right create what are called symptoms, then they go, wait a minute, you mean there's no disease process? And I say, no, there's no disease. It's just metabolic dysfunction caused by mineral dysregulation. And what's the greatest source of mineral dysregulation in the human body? It's called iron, and it'll throw off the body faster than anything else. And that's the whole kit and caboodle in a nutshell. But it's the nuances that I'm sure we'll talk about over the next few conversations, because I think there's a part where your listeners are going to be disbelieving that it's that simple. That it's if it was that simple, I should have known it, and if it was that important, surely my doctor would know about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, we're talking about the most carefully guarded secret on the planet. We're talking about what industry is bigger than big pharma? I mean, really, is there anything bigger than big pharma? Maybe big oil, but certainly big pharma is right up there. And we're talking about the economic infrastructure of the medical system. It dominates the planet. And what does it do? It's all based on fear and intimidation. Oh, you've got the XYZ syndrome. Oh, I do? Oh my God. And then people run back to Google and look it up, and that's exactly what I've got. I've got that. Not realizing that the whole thing's a scam based on copper iron dysregulation, because the doctor never asked them, so what kind of stress are you under? And if people ask that question, they go, I talked to a guy up in the Twin Cities, this was about a year ago. Met with him for an hour and a half over dinner, and he was the youngest pilot in the history of Delta Airlines, and he got Lyme disease. And this guy struggled for 4 or 5 years with this condition, and we're talking. And finally, after about an hour and a half, he said, "Morley, this is the most mind-blowing conversation I've ever had." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you've not once asked me about my symptoms." I said, "Well, dude, no offense, but I don't care about your symptoms. I'm trying to understand all the stress that you had." And he was a total stress cadet. And it made perfect sense that his antioxidant system couldn't neutralize the oxidants that were being shot at him from that initial bug bite. And people don't realize that it's that basic. There is no Lyme disease. There's an overwhelming weakness in the antioxidant capacity of the system. Why? Because every person I've ever worked with who has Lyme disease is iron toxic, 100% of them. But they show up low on a blood test. And that's the nuance, is beginning to learn what a low iron in a blood test really means with iron in the tissue, which is where it likes to hide.
So what you're really saying is there's no way to verify exactly that, like through a blood test, that you're toxic, because you're going to show low iron or some iron on ferrous blood work, which I have patients that have shown both. Some are, in the low highs. But again, that's a whole nother topic, is the range for iron in the body is one of the single most broad ranges of any nutrient in the body, right?
Well, but I've learned that that's a misnomer. That there's 3 different ways iron gets measured in the body. We've talked about hemoglobin.
Yeah.
We've talked about ferritin. And the third way is serum iron. Serum iron is the equivalent of miles per gallon. And what it's revealing is the efficiency of the iron recycling system, which is very important in our vitality. And in any given day, we need 25 milligrams of iron to make the next day's batch of red blood cells. 25 milligrams of iron. 24 of those 25 milligrams comes from recycled iron. 1 milligram comes from our diet. And where there's a lot of confusion is, and so 95% of our iron comes from the recycling system. Where would you guess 95% of the focus of allopathic medicine is? It's on dietary iron. That 1 milligram is supposed to come through the mouth. Oh, it's really important. We got to really understand that. No, you don't need to understand that. It's the most insignificant part of the process. It's the recycling of iron that is one of the most elegant and sophisticated aspects of human physiology. And what does it rely on? Bioavailable copper. And if the copper is not present to enable iron recycling, all hell breaks loose. And that's where all the confusion is. And so the body only needs a whisper of iron. And here's the part that most people don't realize. There was a famous team back in the UK during the 1930s and 40s and 50s. Names were McCants and Widowson. McCants was a pediatrician, and Widowson was a chemist, a PhD chemist. And they were very legendary in their nutritional studies before and after the Second World War. But they published a very important article in 1937 in Lancet. So that's the top of the pecking order. There's no publication higher than Lancet. Maybe Nature Journal, but Lancet is considered the creme de la creme. And in 1937, they published an article that said that there is no excretion of zinc or iron in the human digestive tract. So what does that mean? It means that whatever goes in our mouth stays in our body unless we bleed. The only way to get rid of excess iron in the human body is through blood loss. There is no hormonal process to regulate iron status. Blood loss is where it's at. And there's 2 reasons why women outlive men. 2 reasons. One, women are smarter. That's a proven fact. And second, they have a monthly blood loss for 40 years. And that monthly blood loss lowers their exposure to iron just enough so that they don't have the toxicity that guys have. And testosterone allows us to handle more iron, but it doesn't offset the oxidative stress from that iron. And so the serum iron for a woman should be 100, and the serum iron for a man should be 120. And if it's above it or below it, the miles per gallon is off, the efficiency of the recycling system is off, and therefore the bioavailability of copper is compromised. And bingo bongo, you know right away where the problem is.
Okay, so how does one go about getting their serum iron tested?
Oh, a standard iron panel will have all of those markers. The other thing that people can do, they can go to requestatest.com, and they can look up the Full Monty Iron Panel, which is something that I developed to help clients and people all over the world monitor not just their iron, but look at their zinc, their copper, their ceruloplasmin, as well as their vitamin A and vitamin D. Okay. Because all of those variables are important in this discussion.
So could you repeat that, and I'll make sure I put that in the link. I want to write it down.
Sure. The website is requestatest.com.
Okay.
And there's a menu bar that shows up, and you can go under M for Mag, and within that, you'll see the Full Monty Iron Panel. And it's about, I think it's like $275, something like that. I don't see a penny of that. I did it so that people could really begin to take charge of their situation and start to improve their health.
I did share with you, by the way, and I think I misspoke with it. My serum I had my serum down to 100.
Down to 100. So it's off, about 20%, rough numbers. And so
when you say off 20, do you want? I mean, because the way it sounded, you said that's a good range.
For a woman, 100 is good. For a guy, 120 is good. We can handle 20% more. But if your serum iron was 100, it means it was about 20% below ideal.
And if you're hemochrome and you're going to rebuild that really quickly,
well, that's a significant factor. And so then what that tells us is if you are hemochrome, that means that you lack adequate bioavailable copper to handle that ongoing influx of iron coming into your body. Basically, what's happening is your transferrin receptors are tweaked, and they're allowing too much iron into the system. They're not being regulated properly.
Yeah. Okay. A whole nother topic.
You're not broken, but you're out of balance. It's a big difference. Big difference.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. There's a lot to stomach here. This is going to blow up like all kinds of conversation points.
Well, maybe by the time we get to conversation number 4, I will have a chance to really reveal even more, because what I think we wanted to do in this first conversation was just kind of give people a set of the boundaries of where we're going to be. And I think that, again, back to Alvin Toffler, unlearn, relearn. People have got to literally let go of everything they think they know. People have got all these useless facts about, my thyroid, my TSH and my T3 and T4, and I know what my cholesterol is. It's like, just let it go. Let it go, because it's all irrelevant to what really runs the body. And that's this dynamic tension between that acre of iron and that penny of copper.
Well, and there's something to be said. Maybe we'll wrap up like this today. Yeah, the acre and the penny. I love your storytelling analogies, your visuals. Is that I lost my train of thought with that little penny and acre field, but the capacity of, it's like a diversion. When we went to deductive reasoning in the medical field, like you get to see the endocrinologist, you get to see the heart doctor, you get to see the bladder specialist and neurologist. All it did is highlight the same point of disassociating the big picture of homeostasis to now micromanaging, like any business can't do well when you micromanage. This group is all its own entity. It's like, it's funny, sad, actually, funny, peculiar, is that that's where we're at. And yet it's still so obvious that when you take those small parameters, let's say it is cholesterol, like you said, and the plaquing in all these theories. Now, I lost my mom from a stroke, but there was a story upstream that happened before that. She had a traumatic brain injury, got hit by a car 15 months earlier. She was a German farm girl who literally pulled a plow back in the day. We talked about the water on their farm. And I remember visiting my grandparents, and some of you had this. The sink in the ceramic was stained from rust, and hard water, bathroom tub, and all this. It's like, that is what she grew up in. And it's just fascinating to not look at that as what is how destructive, and you're alluding to it, and you're opening up this world of research that supports it.
Well, what people need, for those who are kind of curious or maybe even skeptical, take whatever label you're most concerned about and go into Dr. Google, put your favorite label and put a plus sign, and then use one of two phrases. Put in copper deficiency, or put in labile iron pool. So copper deficiency is lack of copper. Labile iron pool is there's so much iron, the body doesn't know what to do with it. It doesn't even get into ferritin. And what I think you're going to see is your jaw is going to drop when you realize, oh my gosh, if we don't have copper, or if we have too much iron, it causes every label on the planet. And that's basically what I've done over the last 7 years, is methodically go through the literature to find out, wow, that is the common focal point. And the way I describe it is there is an on-off switch in the human body. The on switch is bioavailable copper when it's allowed to express in that protein called ceruloplasmin. The off switch, too much unbound iron. And it's just your example about your mom alone, it's a crystal clear image that people have that they've never thought to connect the dots about the exposure to iron, and that in that traumatic accident, the injury, the physical injury, caused massive loss of magnesium, which then made her brain tissue more vulnerable to the oxidative stress. I mean, it's a very tragic situation, and my heart goes out to you for losing your mom. But it's just like there's a mechanical, mineral, metabolic explanation for exactly what happens. It's not a disease.
Yeah. And by the way, thank you. But and this was now 2006, so 13 years ago. Mm-hmm. But I remember having this conversation with the neurologist. Blows my mind that the lack of expansive thinking.
What's not part of their training?
She got hit by a car, and I said, "Do you think there's any connection with the physical trauma she experienced 15 months ago, and her history of heart disease, which was hardening, enlarged heart, and as you just said, rusty arteries, which are rigid, like a garden hose that's been weathered by the sun, versus a surgical tubing or a TheraBand."
Right. Sure. Right.
And so I said, do you think there was any likelihood that the perforation in that aorta from being chest, thoracic, head trauma and thrown 15 feet into the grass had anything to do with it? Absolutely coincidental, quote unquote. No relationship to the stroke.
He really said that. Wow.
And it's not
congestive heart failure is code for copper desert. Her heart was a copper desert. And if the aorta ruptured, the enzyme is called lysyl oxidase. It's a copper-dependent enzyme that knits collagen and elastin together to give all connective tissue, including blood vessels, integrity and tensile strength and flexibility. And so if you don't have that enzyme working, the arteries are gonna break. It's axiomatic.
This is me asking a question.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
So for all the peeps, two takeaways from this alone. I have plenty of people that are on the kick for collagen.
Sure.
They're taking collagen or using protein in protein shakes. And what I'm hearing is you can take those great quality proteins, which I do recommend in many cases at different times and needs. But what I'm hearing is it's going to only be micro or small, minimally successful if you don't have healthy levels of copper to make the network with it for your body to use it and put it.
It's like what copper does is a zipper. If it can't come together, that you can take collagen all day long. It's not going to work. And so, and it's in some cases people just have a bad diet and they get benefit from that protein. But when a client doesn't hold their adjustment, right away, you know that it's flip sides of the same coin. They lack bioavailable copper to make the connective tissue, to have the integrity, the tendon, the ligament, whatever it happens to be, and they very likely have excess iron that's rusting that tissue. And that's a stress over oxidation. And so what's the technical term for it? Subluxation, the lack of light, right? Where does the light come from? The light comes from within the cells, from the mitochondria, and they give off red light. When they're healthy, they give off red light. When they're not healthy, they give off green light. So red light, green light, it's backwards from the highway. So we're used to red light is bad and green light is good. Inside our body, it's just the opposite. And so why does red light therapy work? Because it's replacing the process of complex 4 in the mitochondria. And it's blocking the nitric oxide that will shut down complex 4. We'll get into some of that in subsequent conversations.
That's a whole other talk. Wow. Hey, action-packed.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your time today.
Absolutely.
I'm going to drop Morley's information in this link. You guys will see it, and I will. When do you want to talk next? We can figure that out too. But
Hold on.
so I'm going to let these guys go, and you and I can hang on here a bit.
Yeah.
Have an awesome day, all of you listeners. I hope you found a ton of value in this. We will build on clarifying any points. I would love to see any questions, anything you're not getting, anything you want to see more of. Please post below, message me, share this if you find value in it for someone you know who struggles with health, and pass it on. Till next time, this is Dr. Wade and Morley Robbins. We'll see you again.
Thank you much for listening to this week's episode. I look forward to any feedback and or questions you might have. Direct them to our Facebook page, Frankly Speaking, Dr. Wade at Facebook. Okay, my fellow health warriors, it's time to head over to iTunes, franklyspeakingdrwade.com. There, you can rate, review, and subscribe, as well as share, so more of our brothers and sisters can grow to realize their voice. Speaking up means you matter. So, get on it. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views expressed are not medical advice and are not meant to replace the medical advice of your doctor. This podcast, including Dr. Wade Annenson and his guests, disclaim responsibility for any adverse effects you may experience from the specific use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse and accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about the guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for such services or product. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.